Next, from the Union League Club of Chicago, we talk one-on-one with the new Canadian Consul-General Gitane De Silva. We hear how trade between Canada and Illinois provides jobs for hundreds of thousands of Illinois workers, and learn more about how Canadian oil sands are now providing the primary source of oil for Chicago area motorists. This runs about 30 minutes.
Gitane De Silva, thank you for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Thank you very much for having me.
You're the new Consul-General of the Canadian Consulate here in Chicago, and we wanted to speak with you somewhat about your mission and what you're hoping to accomplish. And I know from a previous contact with the Consulate, I was amazed at how much employment there is in Illinois that is tied directly to trade with Canada and indirectly. And I was surprised to learn at some point that actually Alberta, Canada, is Illinois' #1 trading partner.
That's right, more than any other state in the union. Yeah, it's true. There's over 300,000 jobs in Illinois that are directly linked to trade with Canada.
That was an amazing statistic, and actually another one, and I'll throw out, because when I tell people this, it's kind of a jaw dropper, that Canada does approximately 3 times as much trade with Illinois as it does with Mexico.
Yes, it's very true. The U.S. is by far our #1 trading partner, and actually the U.S. trades more with Canada, and Illinois in particular, than you do with the next 5 largest trading partners combined. So the numbers really are staggering. There's about $1.7 billion in trade that cross the border every day, and there's about 60,000 of that that's here with the state of Illinois.
With that in mind, what is the role of the Canadian Consulate here? Are you here to help facilitate that trade, build new partnerships? Is it about importing Canadian products, exporting Illinois products, or just what?
Well, we have, on the trade side, we have 3 main priorities. One is trade advocacy, so when issues like Buy American, when that type of thing comes up. Another interesting statistic about Canada-U.S. trade is that 1/3 is intra-firm trade, so you may have seen that diagram of a chassis of a GM vehicle that shows the various parts, which side of the border they're made on. So we have that example and many others where 1/3 of the trade that crosses the border is in fact intra-firm, and then another third is within an existing supply chain. So when you introduce a measure like Buy American or Buy Illinois, it can have unintended consequences in that it actually hurts Illinois-based businesses, because it could be that an Illinois-based company is trying to go for a government procurement bid and they're deemed ineligible because they have in fact something they've sourced from Canada. So we work very actively on those kinds of issues. We work trying to attract U.S. investment into Canada. Another great statistic we'd like to share is that for every dollar the U.S. invests in Canada in the oil sands or the energy sector in particular, 90 cents of that comes back to the United States. So in addition to the more than 300,000 jobs here in Illinois that are tied to trade with Canada, there's about 7 million jobs in the United States overall that are tied to Canada-U.S. trade, and we've got a lot of examples of suppliers here in Illinois. Caterpillar is a great example where their major contracts are in fact in Canada, so that's a big investment for them. And so we encourage them to invest in Canada or to expand their operations in Canada. And then the other part on the trade side is we facilitate exports, Canadian exporters to the U.S. If we meet a U.S. company here and they're looking for some answer in their supply chain, then we try to encourage them to source that from Canada.
I want to get to a host of issues, but let's focus on, if we might start with the Canadian oil sands. I think Americans sometimes hear these issues. They don't know how the pieces come together, and I kind of want to give them an overview. There's the Canadian oil sand issue. There's the pipeline issue, both Keystone and Enbridge. And first of all, as far as the Canadian oil sands, what does that refer to? Let's start with that, because I don't know that people really know just what that means.
Sure. Well, the oil sands, it refers to a specific type of oil. So it's actually an oil that is in bitumen, it's in sand, and it's very dense, and so it doesn't come out in a liquid form. So they either drill it on site, they do what's called in situ drilling, where they inject water and steam and actually heat it up to a point where it becomes liquid, and then they pump it up. Or if it's deeper than a certain depth, deeper than about 200 meters, then they will actually dig it out. So Canada has the world's 3rd largest oil reserves, and about 97% of that is in the oil sands. And those deposits are largely in Alberta with some pockets in Saskatchewan.
How long has that have we known about the oil sands field, and how long have we been tapping into that? Is that relatively new? Or?
Well, the work's been ongoing, exploration work's been ongoing since the 1970s, but it depended on the economics of it. So now that oil is considerably more per barrel than it was back then, it makes economic sense. That and the technology, the price of the technology has come down considerably as well. It sort of is one of those chicken and egg things where once they get going, then there's more demand, and then they further develop, and they're able to do it at a cheaper rate. So it's really been booming for about the last 10 or 15 years.
It's hard to believe that with the price of oil now at about $100 approximately a barrel, that it wasn't that long ago in the 1990s that we had oil at about $18 a barrel. So probably, it goes to illustrate how the economics have turned around and make this more profitable. So with this huge supply of oil, that's predominantly what, in Alberta? Is
Yes, mostly in Alberta, a bit in Saskatchewan.
That is now being, I don't want to say mined, but
Developed.
thank you. And then brought down here via different pipelines. And one of the big projects currently undergoing is the refinery just across the state border into Indiana, but the Whiting refinery right on Lake Michigan. And there's a huge program going on now to retrofit that refinery to be able to handle the Canadian crude from Alberta.
That's right.
What how are you involved in that, if at all?
Well, we often let business take place between private companies where it can. I mean, if we do need to intervene, then we will. And the Keystone Pipeline is an example where it is a private Canadian company that is looking to build a pipeline, but we've been advocating on their behalf because we think it makes sense for North American energy security. We think it makes sense for jobs on both sides of the border, and we think it makes sense to, just in terms of the economic growth that it'll generate by further developing that resource. And if we can actually get Canadian oil sands crude here to Midwest, and then further down where there's greater refinery capacity, we'll see a difference in price per barrel as well. And each province in Canada, they own the resource, but they pay a portion of the profit that they receive from extracting the resource to the federal government. And in Canada, we have a system whereby we have transfer payments back to our provinces to pay for social programs like healthcare and education. And so it's a benefit to all of Canada, in fact, if we can get a higher price for our oil on the international market.
And as I understand, British Petroleum, which has the Whiting refinery, is looking at it as a cost competitive aspect as well, that they're going to get, they're spending something in the area of $5 billion to retrofit the refinery, but they'll get quite a good return on their investment. But you also touched on energy security. The United States, after the 1973 Arab oil embargo, developed a strategic petroleum reserve in case we had another cutoff of oil. Some people are now saying that Canada is the new strategic petroleum reserve.
Well, we do have a lot of oil in Canada.
And we appreciate you sharing that. Relative to other energy, though, well, let me say this: when you are looking at what's on your agenda and the challenges that you face, what are the challenges you face? What would you want people to know, and what is the, if you could overcome one or two or three particular hurdles that presently face you, what are they, and where do they stand in trying to solve those?
Well, the first thing is, I think a lot of people don't realize that Canada is the #1 supplier of energy to the United States. I think when Americans in particular think about where they get their crude oil from, they would think the Middle East or Venezuela. But Canada by far surpasses any other supplier of oil, and we've been the largest supplier now for about the past 10 years. So that's the first thing, I think, is just increasing the level of awareness. I think the next thing is we do have a challenge when it comes to getting skilled labor to Alberta to further develop the oil sands, and that's something that we're working on. Our Minister of Immigration, in fact, just announced recently that he's going to be looking at ways to bring more temporary workers from the United States in particular up to the oil sands, just to try and get things going. There's right now a huge shortage of welders and pipe fitters and heavy equipment mechanics. So we're trying to address that so that we can further develop that. I think the other thing is people have a misperception about the oil sands in terms of its environmental impact. The greenhouse gas emissions from the oil sands development has decreased 30% over the last 20 years. And while there is certainly further advancements and improvements to be made, I think that demonstrates a real willingness on the part of the industry to make steps in the right direction. I think a lot of people don't know as well that Alberta is one of very few jurisdictions in North America that already has a tax on carbon. There's a very clear, transparent regulatory process. The province is making a lot of investments on the environmental technology side, like in carbon capture and sequestration. And the other thing is that, oil sands, in fact, their greenhouse gas footprint is about 1/20th that of coal. So while it's not pretty to see a development on that magnitude and of that scale, I think that people are really genuinely committed. I myself am from Alberta, so I am biased to put that out there, but there is more to the province of Alberta than just oil sands development. I mean, it is the Rocky Mountains. The other major industry in Alberta is agriculture, so people are very concerned about maintaining the integrity and the health of the land, the health of the water, all those kinds of things. So that's the other message that I'd really put out there, is it's not just exploration and development for the sake of it, that people really are trying to do things in a sustainable manner, because we do think it makes sense for energy security in North America. And you can just imagine how global dynamics would change if North America were oil independent.
And obviously people are hearing, as we've had here with the United States, with the different fields, the Bakken field and others with the fracking, the amount of natural gas that's been available. There's also some trade with Canada, or maybe looking to develop more as far as just electricity and hydro production.
That's right. There's huge trade. 60% of Canada's electricity generation comes from hydro. We have major hydro developments in Quebec, in Manitoba, and BC in particular. And we're very grateful. Some legislation was recently passed in Wisconsin that enables hydro to be counted as a renewable, counts towards a renewable portfolio standard. So we're very happy to see that. Just the way the grid is set up, in fact, the electricity trade doesn't go east-west across Canada, it comes north-south. So we do supply a lot of electricity, mainly in the east, on the eastern seaboard, in the Midwest, and then down through California.
So is the infrastructure, the electrical wiring infrastructure there for all that, or is that still needing to be developed?
No, that's right. I mean, there are updates and improvements being done to the grid, but we work collaboratively, Canada and the United States, together to improve the grid and look to make decisions down the road that make sense in terms of generation and distribution. There are some challenges still in that regard, but it is a very cooperative approach, because we do realize that the flows do go north-south and not so much east-west. So there has been very good cooperation across the border. Like there was the blackout, what would it be, 5 or 6 years ago, that started in Ohio. And I think that really crystallized for people the need to work across the border, that something that happens on one side has an impact on both sides. So the industry and the regulators have been very good about finding opportunities and really sharing information.
I'm sorry to bounce back. I meant to ask earlier when we were talking about the oil sands. The president, as you know, had put a halt on the Keystone pipeline for some environmental concerns. What is the position of the Canadian government on that?
Well, we respect the president's decision. We understand that it is his decision. Of course, we were disappointed. We think that the project makes sense for Canada, and it makes sense for North American energy security, and we're hopeful that down the road he will see fit to approve it.
You're located here in Chicago, not far from Millennia Park. In fact, right across the street as far as your office. Yes. But how much of a territory does the consulate service? Is it just Chicago area? Is it just Illinois, or what?
We do Wisconsin, Illinois, and Missouri. So just the 3 states, with a few counties in Indiana, basically Cook County, and then we also do Kansas City Metro, so both sides, both Kansas City, Missouri, and Kansas City, Kansas.
And if there are people in any of those areas you service who are interested in exporting to Canada, is that something that you could help them with?
It depends on what they're trying to do. In particular, we often put them in touch with the Illinois state officials, because they do have an economic development office here. So if they're looking to export to Canada, sometimes we will be aware of a Canadian supplier that's looking to source something here, and we can help to make those connections. But our primary focus is, of course, helping Canadians export to the United States.
We often hear red tape as a frustration to many business people. What's the, as far as trying to deal business people across the border, is it where it should be? Is there still a lot more red tape that needs to be cut and worked out? Or
well, you may remember that the Prime Minister and the President announced the Beyond the Border Action Plan, would have been in last December, and that has 32 points in it, which are aimed at, one, at basically facilitating trade and the movement of legitimate travelers across the border, pushing out the perimeter, keeping the bad guys out. And then the other part to that is regulatory cooperation, because often what happens on the business front is you'll have one regulation on one side of the border and another on the US side, and they're very similar but just off a little bit. So it means that, there was one example of someone looking to import refrigerators who had to deal with 7 or 9 different US government bodies to get the approvals he needed to import the refrigerator. So that's the type of thing that this initiative is targeting, and we're hopeful that it will really look to reduce red tape. And the government is in particular looking for examples of business people that have had very real challenges, and they want to know what their specific issues are so they can work to address them.
There's some other issues I want to talk about, but before we talk further about that, just tell me a little bit about yourself. You're relatively new to the Chicagoland area. How did you happen to be assigned to this position?
Well, I'm fortunate. I'm a career Foreign Service officer, so I work at Canada's equivalent to State Department, and I spent my whole career working on U.S. issues. So I used to work at Canada's Embassy in Washington. I've managed our network, the public affairs program at our network of consulates across the United States. We have 17 offices in the U.S., and I've also worked on U.S. transboundary issues. I was one of the chief negotiators for the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. So I applied, and I think that given my background and my connections growing up in Alberta and the strong ties between Alberta's prairie provinces and the Midwest, the Prime Minister eventually decided to send me here, and I'm very, very happy to be here. It's a wonderful city, and I feel very much at home in the Midwest.
Well, welcome to Chicago.
Thank you.
And as we sit here in the Union League Club, we're not that far from Lake Michigan. What concerns are there? Because I think a lot of people haven't necessarily focused on that, but
Well, Canada and the United States have cooperated on boundary water issues since 1909. It's in fact one of our oldest treaties, and I think there's very few countries in the world that could collaborate to manage the Great Lakes, which is 20% of the world's freshwater resources, in a way where we've never really had any major conflict about it, and we are both countries genuinely focused on managing the resource sustainably in a way that makes sense for citizens on both sides of the border. That said, I think both countries in the past have had a history of perhaps not protecting the Great Lakes the way they should have been. There are areas of concern on both sides of the border. So we did sign the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement back in the 80s was the first time we signed it, and then it was updated. And we're looking now actually to update it again. So that's just been, the negotiations started in January 2010, and they concluded in January 2012. So we're just waiting now for the official signing to happen. And I think people will be very pleased. It addresses a number of issues, like I said, areas of concern, toxic in the Great Lakes, water usage, ballast water, scientific cooperation, a whole range of things, and of course combating invasive species like the Asian carp.
And let me jump to a little bit of American politics. I won't ask you obviously to take any position as a diplomat. You don't want to ruffle feathers, but does an election in a country that's being served, such as the United States, or how do you handle that within, say, the Canadian diplomatic corps? Do you just kind of say, we're going to stand aside and let every events take their course? I mean, do you have position A and position B just in case there's a change in administration, or does it have no effect on how you operate?
Well, we have positions on specific issues. We, of course, believe it's the will of the U.S. electorate to decide who governs them, but we do watch closely. It's important to us to have good contacts regardless of the political party that's in power, so we do spend a lot of time meeting with members of Congress, senators, both at the state and the federal level, and then, of course, executive level officials. So we do watch. One thing we do notice, of course, is the U.S. election cycle is a bit intense. So we notice that lawmakers and elected officials, their attention can be a bit distracted. So, and we do tend to pay very close attention specifically to pieces of legislation that are moving forward as we get closer to an election, because oftentimes we might see things that slip in there which could have unintended consequences on Canada.
I often, when we're covering the state capitol, we have lobbyists, and we sometimes ask, are you on offense or defense? And it's like they're either pushing a bill or trying to make sure something doesn't get passed. It sounds like you're in somewhat the same position, I guess, trying to represent the interest of your client, which is the country. One of the things, and I think Americans, it's not that they take Canadians for granted, is that we're so similar in culture and language and traditions that you know, fortunately, we don't have to worry about our Canadian neighbors. We have worked very closely in various ways. One of the people may forget, there was a terrorist plot to attack the LA airport, and fortunately at the border, I believe it was in Alberta or Washington.
It was in British Columbia,
British
on the
Columbia.
Canadian side.
Someone was stopped, fortunately. To what extent is there a cooperation between the United States vis-a-vis the terrorism, just defense issues in general?
Well, we work very, very closely on defense issues. In fact, it was a Canadian who was in command of NORAD on September the 11th, and it was the Canadian who made the decision, you know, to have all the planes land. So I don't think that there's, again, an example of two countries that have that level of cooperation. We had Canadians serving with, being commanded by U.S. officers in Afghanistan as well. So that's a long history, and our forces are completely interoperable, I think is the term that they use. And we, in fact, have a few Canadian naval vessels coming to the Great Lakes this summer to celebrate that level of cooperation or history of protecting North America abroad, but also domestic defense. We also work on cross-border law enforcement. So there is a program called Shiprider on the Great Lakes where you have one vessel and there are officers from both sides of the border, and there's this program in place that governs which law is enforced depending on where they are and who's in command, but they work together so that if you've got someone, for example, trying to smuggle drugs from one side of the border to the other across a Great Lake, for example, that they have the authority. You don't have to stop hot pursuit and call someone across the border. And we also work together at airports and all those kinds of things. There's U.S. pre-clearance facilities in Canada where you can, in fact, if you're flying from Canada to the United States, you go through a U.S. CBP entry point, and so you're pre-cleared to enter the United States from Canada, and so our border officials work very closely there as well. And there's a high level of intelligence cooperation. The RCMP and CSIS, our Canadian Intelligence Service, works closely with U.S. officials as well. So it's a great history of collaboration, and I think because of our common history, and I like you, I don't think that people take Canada for granted. I think that everyone has a Canadian connection somewhere, so we're just really part of the family, so they don't think of us as different.
Well, and we were talking earlier about British Columbia. I've been fortunate enough to travel through there. It's one of the prettiest places on earth. I often refer to that area as North America's Switzerland. And if I would say to anyone who hasn't gone there, it'd be a nice time to go, especially in the summertime. I don't know if I'd recommend it necessarily.
If you stay in Vancouver, it's like Seattle. It doesn't ever really get that cold.
One of the historical things going on this year in 2012 is it is the 200th anniversary of the War of 1812, and sometimes people say, yeah, so what? But the Illinois Channel recently, we aired a program on Fort Dearborn, the Battle of Fort Dearborn, which is in downtown Chicago.
Right.
And I understand that the Consulate's going to be engaged in some different events marking the 200th anniversary. What could you tell us about that?
That's right. Well, the War of 1812 also gave you your national anthem, so
Francis
it
Scott
wasn't.
Key.
That's right, absolutely. So we have a number of events. We've got these Canadian naval vessels that are coming for the Air and Water Show. We're doing something with the Pritzker Military Library to highlight, the historical cooperation, look at military cooperation going forward. I think it's really just an opportunity again to take stock of the relationship we've had over the past 200 odd years and where we want to keep going moving forward.
One thing, and I should have probably brought this up earlier, I was just curious, as a child when I traveled to Canada with my family, you just went through and it was pretty much, how you doing, see you later.
Yeah.
Now apparently you need to have a passport, do you?
That's
if
right.
you're an American going into Canada?
That's right. The U.S. implemented something called the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative. So it used to be the Canada and a couple of other countries where U.S. citizens did not need a passport to re-enter the United States. But they changed that probably about 5 years ago now. So now you do need a passport, not so much to get into another country, but to return to the United States.
If anyone is going to be traveling to Canada, is there something they need to know before they go relative to regulations, or should they be touching base with your consulate or some other department?
Well, we can help if people want to know what they would need to get into Canada, and generally a passport is your best bet. But again, if you're a U.S. citizen, you want to make sure you have passports so you can get back in for sure.
Great. And how long will you be in your current position? Is it in other words, a term, or is it where you serve at the pleasure of the Prime Minister?
I do serve at the pleasure of the Prime Minister. Historically, our terms in the United States are 4 years, so I hope to be here for a good long while yet.
And you're married and have a family, do you?
That's right. I have 2 little girls who are 3 and 5, and they're just loving Chicago, spending all summer at the beach, so it's great.
Great. Consul-General Gitane De Silva, thank you for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Well, thank you again for having me. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.